As the old man lay gasping on his deathbed, his trembling hand clutched his grandson's arm. In a voice brittle as autumn leaves, he whispered, "The garden. I buried them, all of them, beneath the garden." The air froze in the room, his family exchanging horrified glances. Each word weighed heavy as stone, unlocking decades of unease and half-forgotten rumors. But the real terror was just beginning. What lay beneath the soil would unravel a lifetime of unimaginable horror. The family had always thought of the garden as Edward Millner's sanctuary. A lush stretch of vibrant rose bushes, towering oaks, and perfectly trimmed hedges, it had been his obsession for decades. Hours spent pruning and planting were just Edward's way of finding peace, or so they believed. But as he lay on his deathbed, those illusions shattered with his whispered words, "I buried them all in the garden." Marcus Millner froze, the air in the room suddenly heavy and unbreathable. He stared at his father, whose gaunt face was etched with a strange mix of guilt and satisfaction. "What are you talking about?" Marcus's voice cracked as he spoke. Edward's hand trembled as it reached for his son's wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for a man so frail. "The garden," he rasped. "The bodies are in the garden." Silence enveloped the room, thick and suffocating. Edward's other children, Sarah and David, stood at the foot of the bed, their faces pale with disbelief. Sarah finally broke the stillness, her voice trembling. "Who, Dad? Who did you bury?" Edward coughed, a sound like dry branches snapping in the wind. "Drifters, people no one would miss. It started with one, but then—" His words faded, his energy drained. Marcus felt a wave of nausea rise in his stomach. This couldn't be real. The garden, the pride of their home, the site of countless family memories, was a graveyard. He looked at Sarah and David, both of them too stunned to speak. His father's confession hung in the air, dark and oppressive. David finally found his voice, though it quivered with uncertainty. "He doesn't know what he's saying. He's delusional." But Marcus wasn't so sure. Something in Edward's eyes, a mix of urgency and resignation, convinced him this wasn't just the rambling of a dying man. "What if he's not?" Marcus whispered, his gaze shifting to the window that overlooked the garden. The nurse stepped in to adjust Edward's oxygen mask, but he swatted her hand away weakly. "No. They need to know," he muttered before his breathing grew shallow. Moments later, his eyes fluttered shut, and the nurse motioned for the family to leave him to rest. That night, the three siblings gathered in the living room, their father's words replaying in their minds. David paced the room, his frustration evident. "This is ridiculous," he said. "Dad was confused. There's no way he buried anyone out there." "Are you sure about that?" Sarah countered, her arms crossed. "You've heard the stories. People disappearing in this area. What if he's telling the truth?" Marcus sat quietly, his thoughts racing. He had heard those stories too, rumors about hitchhikers and drifters vanishing along the highways. He'd dismissed them as urban legends, but now they felt horrifyingly plausible. "I keep thinking about how much time Dad spent out there," Marcus said. "Every single day for years, sometimes all night. We thought it was just his way of coping after Mom died. But what if it wasn't?" Sarah nodded, though hesitation was clear in her eyes. David threw his hands up in frustration. "You're not seriously thinking about digging up the garden, are you?" Marcus didn't respond immediately. The thought was overwhelming. The garden was enormous, nearly an acre of land cultivated over decades. But ignoring their father's confession felt impossible. "Yes," he said finally, "we have to." David groaned, but he didn't argue further. The decision was made. That night, while the rest of the family slept, Marcus and Sarah grabbed shovels and headed to the garden. The moon cast long, eerie shadows over the flower beds. The familiar scent of roses, once comforting, now felt cloying and oppressive. They paused near the garden's edge where a gnarled oak tree loomed over the first row of flower beds. Its roots had spread far and wide, tangling with the earth. Marcus remembered his father warning him never to dig near that tree as a child. He had claimed it was to protect the roots, but now Marcus wondered if the real reason had been far darker. "Start here," Marcus said, pointing to the bed nearest the tree. Sarah hesitated but nodded, and together they drove their shovels into the soil. The sound of metal slicing into dirt was deafening in the stillness of the night. Each shovelful of earth they removed felt heavier than the last. Marcus's mind raced with possibilities. What if they found nothing? What if they found something? "I don't think I can do this," Sarah whispered after a while, her hands trembling. Marcus looked at her, his sister's face pale in the moonlight. "What if we're wrong?" "And what if we're not?" Marcus replied grimly. He kept digging. After what felt like hours, their shovels struck something hard. Both siblings froze. Marcus dropped to his knees and used his hands to clear the dirt away. What he uncovered made his stomach turn. A piece of bone, yellowed and brittle. It was unmistakable. Sarah let out a strangled gasp, stumbling back from the hole. Marcus sat back on his heels, his mind reeling. His father hadn't been delirious. He had been telling the truth. The garden wasn't just a sanctuary. It was a graveyard. The garden felt colder now, as though the air itself recoiled from the secrets being unearthed. Marcus and Sarah stood over the shallow grave, the fragment of bone lying between them like a terrible accusation. Neither sibling spoke, their breaths visible in the chilling night air. It was Marcus who finally broke the silence. "We can't stop now," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "This is just the beginning." Sarah shook her head, stepping back from the hole. "Marcus, this is insane. We found a bone. A single bone. How do we even know it's human?" Marcus shot her a sharp look. "You know it is. You saw it, just like I did." Sarah bit her lip, tears welling in her eyes. "What are we supposed to do? Call the police? Tell them our father buried bodies in the garden? Do you have any idea what this could do to us? To our family?" Marcus sighed, his hands gripping the shovel tightly. He hadn't thought that far ahead. He'd been so focused on finding the truth that he hadn't considered the consequences. But now, staring into the dark soil, he realized they were already too deep to turn back. "We keep digging," he said finally. "If there are more, we need to know." Reluctantly, Sarah picked up her shovel and began digging again, her movements slow and hesitant. The soil was heavy, damp with the evening dew, and every strike of the shovel sent a jolt through her arms. Marcus worked beside her in silence, his face set in grim determination. Hours passed, and the hole grew deeper. They uncovered more bones, fragments at first, then larger pieces that left no doubt about their origin. A skull surfaced next, its hollow eyes staring accusingly up at them. Sarah stumbled back, clutching her chest as a sob escaped her lips. "Oh my God," she whispered. "This is real. This is actually real." Marcus didn't respond. He knelt in the dirt, his hands trembling as he brushed away the soil clinging to the skull. He could barely process what he was seeing, but he forced himself to keep going. He had to know how deep this horror went. By the first rays of dawn they had unearthed an entire skeleton. It lay in the dirt, twisted and broken, as though forced into the grave. The sight was both tragic and grotesque, a stark reminder of the violence that had ended this person's life. "We need to call the police," Sarah said finally, her voice hoarse from hours of digging and crying. Marcus nodded, but his stomach churned at the thought. What would they tell them? That their father, the man who had raised them, was a murderer? That their family's legacy was built on lies and blood? He wasn't sure he could say the words out loud. Before they could decide, a voice called out from behind them. "What the hell are you two doing?" They turned to see David standing on the edge of the garden, his face pale with shock. He stared at the skeleton, his eyes wide with disbelief. "David," Sarah began, but he cut her off. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" he demanded, his voice rising. "What is this?" "It's not a joke," Marcus said quietly. "Dad, he buried them here. He told us last night." David's face twisted in anger and confusion. "You're telling me Dad killed someone, and you just decided to dig it up instead of calling the cops? What the hell is wrong with you?" "We didn't know what else to do," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "We had to know if it was true." David ran a hand through his hair, pacing back and forth. "This is insane. We need to stop. We need to call someone. Anyone." But Marcus shook his head. "Not yet. There's more. I can feel it." David stared at him as though he'd lost his mind. "You can feel it? Are you even hearing yourself? This isn't some detective novel, Marcus. This is real life. People are going to destroy us." "People deserve to know the truth," Marcus shot back. "Whoever this was, they deserve justice." The three siblings stood in tense silence, the weight of their discovery pressing down like a physical force. Finally, David sighed, throwing up his hands. "Fine. Do whatever you want. But when this blows up in our faces, don't say I didn't warn you." He stormed back to the house, leaving Marcus and Sarah alone once more. The garden was eerily quiet. The only sounds the rustle of leaves in the breeze and faint chirping of birds waking to the new day. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus stared at the skeleton, his mind racing. "We keep going. If there are more, we have to find them." And so they did. Over the next days, the garden became a site of grim excavation. They worked in shifts, careful not to let the neighbors see. The more they dug, the more they uncovered. Bones, belongings, fragments of lives that had been cut short. With each discovery, the truth became harder to ignore. Edward Millner, the man they had loved and respected, was a monster. And his garden, once a place of beauty, was now a graveyard of horrors. But the deeper they dug, the more questions they unearthed. Who were these people? Why had Edward killed them? And, most terrifying of all, how many more were there? The house had never felt so unfamiliar. As Marcus, Sarah, and David returned from the garden, their childhood home seemed to mock them with its quiet normalcy. Pictures of smiling family members hung on the walls, and the smell of lavender filled the air. It was hard to reconcile the warmth of this place with the horrors buried just beyond its walls. David was the first to speak as they entered the living room. "So, what's the plan now?" he asked. "Keep digging, or call someone who knows what they're doing?" Marcus sank into the couch, his head in his hands. Days of digging had taken their toll. "We need to figure out who they were," he said finally. Sarah, perched on the arm of a chair, stared at him. "How? It's not like Dad left a list of his victims lying around." "What about the shed?" Marcus asked, lifting his head. "Dad spent as much time there as in the garden. There might be something, notes, tools, anything." David scoffed. "You're reaching, Marcus. Dad wasn't keeping a diary of his crimes." "Do you have a better idea?" Marcus shot back. Before David could respond, Sarah stood. "Enough. If there's even a chance there's something in the shed, we have to check." Reluctantly, David nodded, and the three made their way outside. The shed stood at the edge of the property, half hidden by overgrown bushes. It had always been off-limits when they were kids. Edward's sanctuary, he had called it. The door creaked as Marcus pushed it open. Inside, shelves were lined with tools, jars of screws, and containers of seeds. But something felt off. It wasn't just the dust or mildew. It was the sense they were trespassing in a place that held more than just gardening supplies. Sarah spotted it first, a wooden chest shoved into the corner. "Over here," she called softly. The chest was locked, but David quickly found a crowbar. With a few hard pries, the lid popped open, revealing old notebooks, yellowed papers, and a small, leather-bound journal. Marcus reached for the journal first. The leather was cracked with age, the corners worn smooth. As he opened it, the faint scent of old paper wafted up. The first page was blank, but the second was filled with Edward's precise handwriting. June 12, 1985, Marcus read aloud, his voice shaking. The first one. I didn't mean for it to happen. He came to the door asking for food and something in me snapped. I didn't want to hurt him, but I couldn't stop. The siblings exchanged horrified glances as Marcus continued reading. Each entry detailed another victim, another moment when Edward had succumbed to the darkness within him. Some were strangers. Others were neighbors, people who had suspected too much or asked too many questions. Sarah clutched her stomach, bile rising in her throat. "Oh my God," she whispered. He was keeping track, like it was some kind of twisted hobby. David snatched the journal from Marcus's hands, flipping through the pages. "This can't be real," he muttered. How could he do this? How could we not know?" Marcus's gaze drifted to the notebooks and papers still in the chest. "There's more," he said, reaching for a bundle. The papers inside were crude drawings of the garden, with X's marking specific spots. "Maps," he said, his voice hollow. "These are maps of the graves." Sarah turned away, tears streaming down her face. David slammed the journal shut, his hands shaking. "We need to burn this," he said. "All of it. We can't let anyone find out." "No," Marcus said sharply. "We can't cover this up. People deserve to know what happened. The families of those people—" "They'll know our family as monsters," David interrupted. "Is that what you want? To have our name dragged through the mud for something we didn't do?" "It's not about us," Marcus snapped. "It's about them. The people Dad killed. They deserve justice." The two brothers glared at each other. Finally, Sarah stepped between them, her voice trembling but firm. "Stop it, both of you. This isn't about what we want. It's about what's right. Marcus is right. We can't bury this. Not again." David threw up his hands in frustration but didn't argue further. Marcus turned back to the chest, his mind racing. There were too many victims, too many secrets, and they were only just beginning to uncover the full scope of their father's crimes. As they left the shed, Marcus clutched the journal tightly, his mind swirling with unanswered questions. Who were the victims? Why had their father done this? The weight of the journal seemed to grow heavier in his hands with each passing moment. They stopped just outside the shed, the cold air biting at their faces. "What if this is just the beginning?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" Marcus turned to her. Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting to the dark expanse of the garden. The way he wrote about it. It wasn't just something he did. It was something he needed to do. What if there are more victims? Not just here, but somewhere else? The thought sent a chill down Marcus's spine. Could their father's crimes extend beyond the garden? Beyond their home? The journal had hinted at so much, yet revealed so little. "We need to keep going," Marcus said, though his voice wavered. "We need to know the full truth." And as they returned to the house, the journal clutched tightly in his hand. The night seemed darker than ever before. The secrets of the past were coming to light, but with each revelation, the shadows grew deeper. The night after finding the journal was restless for all three siblings. The weight of their discovery hung heavy over the house. Marcus couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined the faces of the victims their father had buried, people he had passed off as strangers when they were children. Now, those strangers had names, stories, and endings they hadn't deserved. At dawn, Marcus made his way to the kitchen, where Sarah was already sitting at the table, clutching a steaming mug of coffee. Her eyes were bloodshot, and the dark circles beneath them made it clear she hadn't slept either. "You're up early," he muttered, taking a seat across from her. "I couldn't sleep," Sarah admitted. She motioned toward the journal sitting in the center of the table as though it had been taunting her all night. I tried reading more of it, but I couldn't. It's like every page gets worse." Marcus nodded grimly. Every victim Edward described was dehumanized, a hitchhiker who wouldn't stop talking, a drifter asking for trouble. It wasn't just the killing that haunted Marcus, it was the cold, methodical way Edward had justified it. Before they could continue, David entered, rubbing his temples. "So, what's the plan?" he asked, his voice laced with frustration. "Are we just going to keep reading until we lose our minds?" "We need answers," Marcus said, his tone firm. "We need to map out the garden using these sketches, figure out exactly how many graves there are." David groaned, slumping into a chair. "You're insane. Why keep going? We already know Dad was a monster." Sarah shot David a glare. "Because it's not about us. It's about the victims. We owe it to them to figure out the truth." With heavy hearts, the siblings gathered their tools and returned to the garden. The journal and maps served as their guide, leading them to flower beds and patches of earth that, until recently, had seemed ordinary. Now, they were sites of horror. The first grave they dug that day contained the skeletal remains of a young woman. Her bones were small and delicate, and a faint rusted bracelet clung to her wrist. Sarah choked back a sob as she unearthed the bracelet, clutching it in her trembling hands. "She was someone," Sarah whispered, "someone who had a life, a family, and he just buried her like she was nothing." Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, but he didn't know what to say. The enormity of what their father had done felt overwhelming. For every grave they unearthed, the weight of guilt and shame grew heavier. By the end of the day, they had uncovered 2 more graves. Each one held a story they would never fully know, and each one shattered whatever illusions they had left about Edward Millner. The man they had admired, who had taught them to ride bikes and read bedtime stories, was a monster, someone who had stolen lives and buried them beneath a garden he had pretended was a sanctuary. That night, as the siblings sat in the living room, Sarah broke the silence. "I keep thinking about the stories he used to tell us," she said, her voice trembling. "The ones about protecting the garden. How he'd get so angry whenever we played too close to the flower beds. I thought it was because he loved the flowers, but now I think it was because he was protecting his secrets." David exhaled sharply, his face pale. "This is going to destroy us," he said. "If people find out, they'll never see us as anything other than his children. They'll think we're like him." Marcus shook his head. "That doesn't matter. This isn't about what people think of us. It's about justice. Those people deserve to be found. Their families deserve answers." Sarah nodded, though tears streaked her face. "He didn't just bury bodies in this garden," she said. "He buried the truth, and if we don't dig it up, who will?" Despite their exhaustion, the siblings resolved to continue their grim work the next day. As they prepared for bed, Marcus flipped through the journal one last time. Toward the back, he found an entry that sent a chill down his spine. May 4th, 1992. "She came back today. I thought she was gone for good, but I was wrong. She stood at the edge of the garden, staring at me, accusing me. I tried to ignore her, but I could feel her eyes on me, burning into me. I couldn't let her leave again." Marcus closed the journal, his hands trembling. Who was she? What had she known? And how had she ended up in the garden? The questions haunted him as he climbed the stairs to his room. The more they uncovered, the darker the truth seemed to grow. Sleep eluded Marcus once again, and as he stared at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that their father's crimes weren't just a thing of the past. Something about the journal, about the way Edward had written, made him wonder if there were more secrets waiting to be uncovered, secrets that extended beyond the garden. The next morning, the siblings' resolve hardened as sunlight streamed through the windows. The journal sat on the kitchen table, its presence a reminder of the horrors they still had to face. Marcus had spent most of the night rereading the entry about the mysterious woman. She came back today. Those words echoed in his mind. David broke the silence over breakfast. "We need to call the police," he said flatly. "This is too big for us. We're not investigators." Marcus shook his head. "Not yet. We don't know how deep this goes. When the police show up, they'll dig everything up. It'll be all over the news. They won't just expose Dad. They'll expose us, too." "Maybe we deserve it," David said bitterly. "How do you grow up with a man like that and not notice anything?" Sarah's voice cracked. "We didn't know because he made sure we didn't. He was different with us. You can't blame us for what he did." Marcus grabbed the journal. "We start with the next location. If we find more, maybe then we call someone." Reluctantly, Sarah and David followed him to the garden. The air was crisp, but the garden felt oppressive, a silent witness to decades of horror. With the maps in hand, Marcus led them to the farthest corner of the property near the old compost pile. The soil was softer, disturbed more recently than the others. Their shovels bit into the earth, and within an hour, they uncovered another skeleton. This one was different. The bones were smaller, fragile, and the remains were wrapped in a tattered piece of cloth that looked like it had once been a dress. Sarah gasped and stumbled back, her face pale. "It's a child," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Oh my God. It's a child!" Marcus froze. He had prepared himself for more victims, but this was something he hadn't been ready for. Edward had killed a child? The thought made his stomach churn. David dropped his shovel and turned away, his hands on his knees. "This is too much," he muttered. I can't do this anymore." "We have to keep going," Marcus said, though his voice was barely audible. "We have to know who she was." They found no belongings in the grave, only the small skeleton wrapped in fabric. Sarah cradled the torn cloth in her hands, as though it might offer answers, but it didn't. It only deepened the mystery. That evening, back in the house, Marcus pored over the journal, searching for any mention of the child. Toward the middle, he found an entry that made his blood run cold. August 17th, 1988. She wouldn't stop crying. I tried to explain, but she didn't understand. None of them ever do. It's better this way. She'll stay in the garden, where she belongs. Marcus slammed the journal shut, his hands trembling. How could their father have done this? How could someone capable of such evil have been the same man who had kissed them goodnight? Sarah and David joined him in the living room, their faces hollow with exhaustion. Marcus hesitated, but eventually read the entry aloud. When he finished, Sarah broke into sobs, and David just shook his head. This is evil," David finally said. "Pure evil." "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We keep digging," Marcus said. "There's more to this. He wrote about a woman who came back. Who was she, and how many more are there?" The next day they returned to the garden, each step heavier than the last. Every shovel of dirt felt like unearthing another piece of their shattered family. They worked in silence. By midday they uncovered another grave. This one held an adult skeleton, but unlike the others there were signs of a struggle. The bones were broken in places, and near the remains they found something startling. A set of car keys. The keychain was rusted but still intact, bearing a faded insignia of a local church. Marcus turned the keys over in his hand. "This person wasn't just some random drifter," he said. "They lived here. They had connections." Sarah's hands trembled as she pointed to the journal. "Does it say anything about them?" Flipping through the pages, Marcus found an entry that seemed to match. March 3rd, 1990. She asked too many questions. She said she'd call the police. I couldn't let her ruin everything. The garden keeps its secrets. David swore under his breath. This isn't just murder. This is a cover-up. He was silencing people who knew too much. Marcus nodded grimly. And we're the ones left to uncover it all. As they packed up their tools, Sarah stared at the garden, her expression one of both sorrow and determination. "It feels like they're speaking to us," she said softly. "The victims. It's like they've been waiting for someone to find them." Marcus didn't respond, but he felt it too. A strange, unshakable sense that the garden was more alive than it had ever been, its secrets finally coming to light. That night, Marcus sat alone in the living room, the journal open on his lap. He couldn't stop reading, couldn't stop searching for answers. The entries blurred together, each one more horrifying than the last. But one thing was clear: they were far from finished. Edward's crimes ran deeper than they had imagined, and the garden was just the beginning. The final day in the garden felt heavier than the others, as though the earth resisted giving up its secrets. Marcus, Sarah, and David worked in silence, exhaustion etched on their faces. They had uncovered too many graves, each one chipping away at their humanity and sense of identity. The man who had raised them was a stranger, a monster, and the weight of that truth was crushing. The journal led them to the base of the old oak tree at the center of the garden. Edward often sat beneath the tree, reading or tending to his tools. Now they realized it wasn't a place of rest, it was a place of burial. "This is the last one," Marcus said hoarsely. He wasn't sure if he was reassuring himself or his siblings. The map indicated one final grave beneath the oak's shadow. Sarah hesitated, her hands trembling as she gripped the shovel. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," she whispered. "We have to," Marcus replied. "We're almost there. We need to know the truth." David didn't argue this time. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, but he joined them in digging. The soil was dense and root-filled, making the work slow and grueling. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher, casting harsh light on their grim task. Finally, Marcus's shovel struck something solid. He froze, his breath hitching. "I think I hit something," he said. Together, they uncovered the remains, a skeleton like the others. But this one was different. It wasn't alone. Wrapped in a decaying tarp were two sets of bones, tangled together. One was adult-sized, the other much smaller. The sight stole the air from their lungs. Sarah fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. Who were they?" she choked out. David picked up a rusted necklace from the grave, its small pendant engraved with the name Lillian. "She has a name," he said quietly. "At least this one does." Marcus flipped through the journal, his hands trembling. Toward the back he found an entry that matched. October 12th, 1993. She came back and she brought her child. I told her she couldn't stay, but she wouldn't leave. She said she'd tell everyone. I didn't have a choice. The garden keeps its secrets. Marcus read the entry aloud, his voice breaking. The woman had come back, just as Edward had written. She had come with her child, seeking answers, or justice, and Edward had silenced them both. The tangled bones in the grave told the rest of the story. "This is evil," David muttered, his voice shaking with rage. "He killed a mother and her child. For what? To protect his garden?" "No," Marcus said hollowly. "To protect himself. The garden was his excuse." Sarah stared at the grave, tears streaking the dirt on her face. "We need to call the police," she said finally. "We can't do this alone anymore." Marcus nodded, his resolve breaking. They had done all they could. The truth was too big, too horrifying to keep hidden. It wasn't just about their family anymore. It was about giving the victims their voices back. They returned to the house where Marcus made the call. The words felt foreign in his mouth as he explained what they had uncovered. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but Marcus could hear the shock beneath her professionalism. When the police arrived, the garden became a crime scene. Officers and forensic teams swarmed the property, documenting everything. The siblings watched from the porch, their hands clasped tightly together. It was over. The truth was finally out. As the day turned to night, an officer approached them, his expression grim. "We'll be here for days, maybe weeks," he said. "This is one of the largest crime scenes I've ever seen. Do you have any idea how many victims there might be?" Marcus shook his head. "No," he admitted. "We only found some of them. There could be more." The officer nodded. "You did the right thing by calling us. These people, whoever they were, they deserve justice." The siblings stayed on the porch long after the officers left, staring at the garden that had once been their sanctuary. It was unrecognizable now, a patchwork of graves and evidence markers. The beauty Edward had cultivated was gone, replaced by the grim reality of his actions. "What happens now?" Sarah asked softly. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He looked at the garden, then at the journal still clutched in his hand. "We move forward," he said finally. "We tell the truth. We let people know who he really was, and we try to make peace with it." David shook his head. "There's no peace in this," he said. "There never will be." "Maybe not," Marcus admitted, "but at least the garden isn't hiding its secrets anymore." For the first time in days, the siblings allowed themselves to breathe, even if the air felt heavy. The garden, once a place of beauty, had become a graveyard of horrors, but it was no longer silent. The truth had been unearthed, and with it, a sliver of justice for the victims Edward had buried there. As they sat together in the dark, the journal lay open between them, its pages fluttering in the breeze. The garden had spoken, and its voice would echo far beyond the fences of their family home. For the first time, it felt like the victims were finally free,